This video presentation is designed to accompany your study of Requiem for a Beast by Matt Ottley. This will go through a range of contextual factors relevant to your understanding of the text and the thematic concerns therein, and will also demonstrate how to apply a range of ATAR English syllabus concepts to your study of the text. First and foremost, a really thorough understanding of the context that underpins the construction of Requiem for a Beast is a really integral place to start. The authorial context of Matt Ottley is something that cannot be divorced from your understanding of the text as a whole. Matt Ottley is a man who has imbued a lot of his own life experiences into this text. His experience as a child growing up in Papua New Guinea, his family background, and in particular, relationships he has had with male role models in his life. By his own admission, Ottley struggled with feeling as though he didn't embody stereotypical masculine traits throughout his childhood and adolescence, in stark contrast to members of his family who fell firmly into the camp of embodying what it meant to be a true blue Aussie man. This led to some issues and insecurities, which contributed to some mental ill health in his later adolescence. Ottley also worked in remote cattle stations in the far north of the country, large, expansive, extensive agricultural land which was quite desolate and required quite a hardy approach to life. It was here he witnessed firsthand the darker side to Australian masculinity, characters in his text embodying these negative traits. In later life, Ottley also lived and worked with the Bungalang community, an Indigenous language group in northern New South Wales. He was almost initiated as a member of this community, having undergone their rites of passage and traditional ceremonies. As a result, much of his structure in Requiem for a Beast is based around Bungalang storytelling and mythology. In many respects, Requiem for a Beast is semi-autobiographical, drawn from the life experiences of author Matt Ottley. Authorial context cannot be overlooked where this text is concerned. And when it comes to considering how authors imbue their texts with particular perspectives and views of the world, Requiem for a Beast is a really valuable text to study with regard to the English ATAR syllabus. Published in 2006, the production context and the context of the world of the text, that is the context of the setting, are ostensibly one and the same. It's vital here that you also pay close attention to the representation of Australian society, in particular this concept of outback Australia and the social mores and tropes that pervade rural and remote lifestyles, particularly the representation of gender and masculinity in this context, and the way in which harsh living conditions breed certain values and attributes in individuals. Finally, Requiem for a Beast in many respects can be considered an allegorical text in the way that it deals with the treatment of Aboriginal people at the hands of white Australia. In particular, the text deals with successive government policies that contributed to the disempowerment of Aboriginal people through events such as the Stolen Generation and the intergenerational trauma which continues to this day. The following areas of context research are integral to your understanding of the text, not only in recognising the thematic concerns, particularly those with regard to racism, xenophobia, and issues pertaining to masculinity, but also aspects of identity, and particularly Australian identity, and the figures and mythology that exists in Australian culture that contributes to our behaviour, and the prevailing attitudes that shape our lives. Completing this context research will also have implications for your ability to discern the layers of symbolism which are embedded into this text. Ottley really is a fan of an illusion and links to Greek mythology, figures that mythologised in Australian culture, such as the Stockman or Ned Kelly, as well as the Latin Requiem Mass, are quite integral to your understanding of Otley's purpose in constructing Requiem for a Beast. As is the case when commencing any new text study, it's integral to consider the form, genre, mode and medium of the text's construction. This enables us to work out what conventions are applicable when analysing the text. In the case of Requiem for a Beast, the text is a graphic novella. A novella obviously is shorter than a novel, and the text is a graphic novella because the content is conveyed through images, much like a comic book, but with a far more extensive narrative. In terms of the text's genre, if we look at the text as its form, this would become the graphic novella again, whereas if we look at the subject matter of the text, that is, we look at the way a text is classified based on the thematic concerns or the world that the text creates, we would deem it to be an allegory, or in some instances a Bildungsroman, that is a coming-of-age text whereby a protagonist journeys into a greater sense of understanding of themselves and their place within the world. Another aspect of a text construction which needs to be considered before undertaking analysis is the mode through which information is communicated. For instance, a novel almost extensively uses the written mode of communication. This is the dominant way in which that text communicates meaning. Whereas a feature film or a documentary primarily uses both spoken and visual images in order to communicate meaning. Requiem for a Beast, however, through the medium of a graphic novella, utilises a written narrative, visual images, as well as an audio soundtrack composed by the author Matt Otley. And these are the three dominant ways in which the text communicates meaning. Accordingly, we would classify Requiem for a Beast as a multimodal graphic novella. The text is multi-layered. It combines the written narrative with visual images and the audio soundtrack in order to create meaning. To appreciate this text in its entirety, it's integral that you analyse and reflect on how each of these three modes of communication are used in conjunction to affect the meaning that you take away from the text. When undertaking your own analysis, it's important to remember that the purpose of this text, that is the meaning that is being transmitted by the author, is done so through the use of a range of different conventions. In Requiem for a Beast, we analyse the text on the basis of its generic conventions of narrative, the language techniques used through the written mode of communication, the visual construction of images within the text, the structure of the text itself, a technique that will be expanded upon for you in further slides, as well as the auditory elements, the use of symbolism and illusion in the soundtrack, and the way that this helps to establish mood within the text that aligns with the story's content. Moving on to more specific elements of the text construction, one of the first things you need to note with Requiem is that it uses a shifting narrative point of view. That is, there are 3 points of view used in this text. This can sometimes become confusing for readers, but there are a few tips that I can offer which will help you distinguish between the individuals, or in fact the narrator, when they are telling the story. First and foremost, note that the text uses 3 different fonts. Each of these fonts denotes a type of point of view. The first is the use of first-person point of view of the boy. Now, the boy is the protagonist of our story. Whenever this point of view is being used, you'll note the personal pronouns of I, but also the font itself will look like printed handwriting. Typically, it's used in the form of a diary entry, excerpts from letters, or is overlaid on images, particularly in sections of the text that are structured to look like a more conventional comic. The first-person point of view of the boy is primarily used by Otley to reinforce the internal landscape and the emotional journey that this character undertakes. As the protagonist, it's their growth and development that we are really focusing on in the text. The second use of point of view is that of third-person limited, whereby Otley employs a narrator. This narrator is used to progress the linear plotline of the story. Through the narrator, we witness the boy undergoing his journey. And while the narrator focuses primarily on the boy's experiences, we also get this sense of more emotional distance, and we're able to see the boy's story unfold in a more logical or linear manner. That often helps to clear some of the muddier waters that arise in this text, where you find a lot of dreamscapes or flashbacks being used that can sometimes confuse readers by breaking up the text's otherwise linear chronology. Lastly, Requiem for a Beast also employs first-person point of view through the voice of the Aboriginal elder. Written in an italicised font which appears to be cursive handwriting, this voice enables us to see through the eyes of Indigenous Australia and their experiences and suffering at the hands of white Australia. Now, the first-person point of view of the elder is employed primarily towards the end of the text in a few excerpts. The elder's voice also appears through the boy's dream sequence, whereby her story, as heard by the boy when he visits the community centre and listens to her speak prior to his arrival on the stock ranch, becomes imbued in his dreams. He recounts this and remembers this storytelling in his dreams, and it takes on a slightly frightening effect at several points. With regard to your own reading of Requiem for a Beast, it's really essential that you pay attention to the change in font and recognise that this denotes a shifting point of view, either that of the boy, that of a narrator, or that of the Aboriginal elder. The study of Requiem for a Beast also lends itself to quite a close analysis of the concept of voice. Now, it's worth noting here that voice is a syllabus concept and is not, in fact, a technique. Voice is constructed through the way in which a text is written, and this can include the structural features of language or the language choices themselves. And text can also contain multiple voices. Now, this does not always align with point of view, and in fact, the voice of an author can also be imbued in a text in the way in which it communicates meaning. Voice is essentially the means through which a different viewpoint, position, or idea of an individual or group is conveyed. Now, a text can contain multiple voices. These may align with one another or may serve to act in contrast to one another, but is a very essential way through which a text shapes an audience to respond. In Requiem for a Beast, we have quite strong voices conveyed in the characters of the boy, his father and the Aboriginal elder, and to a lesser extent the characters of Sharky, Jono and Rudy, all of which come to represent groups of people or particular ideas and issues that impact people in the world. The text is also a really valuable way in which we can explore perspective. Now, to put it simply, a perspective is an opinion informed by context. Each individual will have a different position from which they view the world, and this is informed by aspects of their context that shape their belief systems and the attitudes that they hold. When looking at Requiem for a Beast, it's really important to note that while individual characters will hold their own perspectives, that authorial perspective is also present in this text. Through its construction, Matt Otley is endeavouring to transmit to the reader very specific ideas and issues, and each of these he comes at from his own perspective. There is an intended meaning that he is hoping you will take away from this text. Much like voice, it's also important to note that perspective is also a syllabus concept and is not a technique in its own right. A significant feature of the text's construction is the use of symbolism and illusion as a means by which Matt Otley reinforces the purpose of this text. Requiem for a Beast uses highly symbolic graphic sequences and layers of illusion in order to not only reinforce elements of context, but also to advance the message of this text. Figures such as Ned Kelly and the Man from Snowy River are used in order to help readers reflect on the nature of Australian identity, in particular the way in which we have venerated or glorified figures and mythologised them into a part of our own cultural identity, through which we may justify less than moral behaviour. In the case of Ned Kelly, we have a figure who operated supposedly for the greater good, Australians' own Robin Hood. The representation of this figure alongside that of the classic Australian stockman or Aussie battler go a ways to reinforcing the representation of Australian identity, particularly as it intersects with masculinity, in that suck it up, toughen up kind of ideal, whereby hardship is something to be battled through and taken on the chin, or, for lack of a better expression, taken like a man. For the character of the boy, and indeed the boy's father, these romanticised views of masculinity and the take it on the chin mentality that accompanies it are overall quite detrimental to the character's well-being and in fact their mental health. The questionable morality of figures such as Ned Kelly and the intersection that this plays with masculinity also go away towards explaining how events such as the stolen generation and the systematic dispossession of Aboriginal people have occurred in our past, often justified through the eyes of the common good. The treatment of Indigenous people under the stolen generation as a form of cultural genocide is something that people grapple with to this day. In the text, Otley deals with these experiences through the story and first-person narration of the elder, who looks at the loss of Indigenous culture as a detrimental aspect of Australia's attitudes and Australian identity. Links made to Greek mythology, particularly stories of the centaur and the minotaur, function in the text as a way of interrogating the bestial nature of man, those impulses or behaviours that may be motivated by a baser instinct. In many respects, this is used ironically to represent the way that Aboriginal people have long been deemed beasts by white Australia, but in fact it is the actions of white Australia and the xenophobia that pervades this culture that has contributed to the mistreatment of Indigenous people themselves. Finally, the allusions made to the Latin Requiem Mass are integral to the understanding of the audio soundtrack, but are also used symbolically as a means by which the text is structured. You'll notice the text is broken into 4 parts, each of these named for aspects of the Requiem Mass. Now, this Mass is an important symbol in the text. It's a Mass held for the repose of the soul of the dead, or people who are deceased. Essentially, this sacred composition sets music against a religious text. It's often chanted and is primarily communicated in Latin. One of the first things that you notice when you turn to the title page for part 1 is both the Latin title Dies Irae, and then watermarked behind this is the lyrics to the Latin script, or the hymn of Dies Irae. And you'll see in that watermark it also says Day of Wrath. This is what Dies Irae translates to. And in the Requiem Mass, it's a hymn that denotes the concept of judgment, the idea that those who pass away will come before the judgment of God, that the last trumpet will summon souls before the throne of God, and those who will be saved will be delivered into heaven, and those who are not will be cast into the eternal flames of damnation. If you turn to page 85 of your text, you'll find the lyrics to track 1 of the CD that can be found in the back for Dies Irae. Now, there are 2 pieces of text overlaid here. The first is a Bungalan story, which is told by an elder, and it's called Ghost Story. It's about the concept of colonisation, the fear that Indigenous people held when white settlers arrived at Australia, and that concept of the ghost, this fearful idea of settlers invading the land, and this possibility that the stranger will take them or carry them away. This is foreshadowing the events of the stolen generation. Below this, Dies Irae, is the Latin hymn. Now, this denotes the idea of judgment, of fear, that the acts that we commit in life will be how we are judged when we reach the end of our time. And this essentially is symbolic of the function of part 1 of the text. You note here that the narrative is essentially the boy's story, the boy's journey and arrival on the stock ranch, and it also includes several flashbacks or memories to his childhood, the events that shaped the person that he is and came to motivate his decision to go to the ranch in the first place. This section of the text encourages readers to reflect on concepts of judgment, the way in which judgments are cast, and also the way in which individuals will be judged by their behaviour on the basis of social mores, and how those changing mores may in fact alter the way that we perceive behaviour over time and in different contexts. It is also in this part of the text where it becomes most apparent that the bull is in itself a symbol. It becomes a metaphor for the means by which Indigenous culture was colonised by white society. The boy finds comfort in the fear of the men on the muster. That sense of belonging is symbolic of how contextual racism and xenophobia bind people together, and how white society found solace in a sense of cultural superiority that was ignited by fear. Part 2 of the text, Mors stupidabit e natura, translates to death and nature stupefied. This is where the allegorical nature of this text really comes to the fore. The inclusion of the elder's story allows the journey of the boy to be seen as an allegory. We draw parallels between his search for identity and the stolen generations, and the search that they underwent for a sense of family and belonging. The boy endeavours to conform to cultural norms and expectations his society holds for him. This is what motivates him to travel to the ranch in the first place, an attempt to prove his masculinity, to emulate his father, and to prove to himself in many respects that he is capable of engaging in the world as an adult man. The boy's own journey and attempt to overcome the judgments that he places on himself and he feels placed on him by society are juxtaposed against that of the Aboriginal elder, who in the community hall is delivering a speech. Upon his arrival in the town, while he's waiting to be collected, the boy attends this speech, and he recounts her words about the events of the stolen generation, the loss of identity and belonging that resulted from the forced removal of children, and the subsequent intergenerational trauma, alcoholism, suicide, promiscuity, the means in which people attempted to escape their dehumanised states. In part 2, those lyrics of the ghost story are also overlaid over the text. demonstrating to us that it is these hang-ups from the past, these judgments and this fear of the unknown and the xenophobia that arose from this that contribute to the trauma of Indigenous people today. Part 3, Lacrimosa, translates to weeping. This is the section of the text where the climax is reached, where the boy's conflict and struggle within himself to prove himself that he is in fact a man culminates in his pursuit and tackling of the bull. Ultimately, what the boy realises in this moment is not that he has proven himself to be all of those things that he thought he was lacking in, but that he feels a sense of grief, that he recognises that his actions have only caused sorrow and suffering. This is juxtaposed against the dream sequence of the boy, where he looks at the experiences of Rudy and Rudy becoming a beast, and reinforces the allegorical nature of the text, that the judgment or the fear that we possess of the things we don't understand or of the qualities that we assume ourselves to need to hold are the things that ultimately prove to be our undoing. Part 3 is also where the story of the father and the contributions he made to his son's life and the negative stereotyping he reinforced is also demonstrated to us. In the father's own life experiences, he feels regret for the suffering and the trauma that he has inflicted upon others. Part 3 ends with this metaphor of a tether, being tied down, being trapped. This idea of the rope that connects the child to this beast-like figure symbolises the idea that it is in fact prejudice, it is judgment, it is the misconceptions that we hold of individuals or the misconceptions that we hold of ourselves that are ultimately what bring about our undoing. Lastly, part 4, Père Jésus, translates to merciful Jesus. And this part of the text is ultimately the resolution, not only of the boy's journey and sense of introspection and that sense of epiphany that he's come to understand himself, but also that he's come to understand the impact that past events have on shaping our present and our future. And more symbolically, the way that the treatment of people within the past, such as Indigenous people in the events of the stolen generation, come to impact them in the present. Ultimately, the symbolism of Père Jésus is that mercy and forgiveness and seeking redemption is the way in which we can right the wrongs that have been perpetrated against innocent people and attempt to make up for the events of the past and move together into a better future. In much the same way that breaking the text into 4 parts, each alluding to a different aspect of the Requiem Mass, is a structural device used in this text in order for Matt Ottley to emphasise certain moments within the narrative and also to emphasise certain thematic concerns. Ultimately, the narrative structure of Requiem for a Beast employs a cyclical structure. Now, this is an homage to Bungalan culture and the idea that the events in our past impact us in our present lives, and the events of our present will go on to impact us in our future. Otley is attempting here to draw on or make allusions to the chronology of Bungalan storytelling. Obviously, living and being initiated into this Indigenous language group has had a profound effect on his concepts of storytelling and the idea that the experiences of our ancestors influence us in our present lives. Ultimately, what Otley does in Requiem for a Beast is create a plotline that for some students can be quite convoluted and confusing. The story takes place in 3 dimensions of time, and these are interspersed throughout the text through the use of flashback and flash forward. Simply put, if you pay attention to the different types of font being used in the narrative, you'll be able to identify the different points of view and more easily jump between the story of the boy, the elder, and the overarching linear plot structure as told by the narrator. There are a few tips and tricks I can also offer you in unravelling the intersecting storylines in this text. Ultimately, the first thing you need to keep in mind is that the story is linear. There is a direct, chronological series of events that are occurring in this text. The boy leaves home, he travels to the stock ranch, goes out on a cattle muster one morning, and in the course of this muster he gets sidetracked and follows a rogue bull into the bush, and in an attempt to conquer it, backs it into a corner of an amphitheatre and attempts to throw it. That is, tackle it to the floor and tie its legs together as a means of capturing it. This is the linear plotline. The story ends when the boy is collected by Rudy and taken back to the rest of the men at the muster. However, the story is interspersed with the experiences of the boy in his childhood, as well as his experiences in hearing the elder at the community hall and memories he has of interactions with his father in his younger years. One of the easy structural features that Otley uses quite consistently is that you'll notice the colour of the page changing when the text is being told by the third-person narrator, that is the linear plot line of the boy on his journey through the bush and following the bull. The pages will be in white. Whenever you notice that the background changes to black, this indicates either a dream sequence or a memory. Often it reads as though it's a diary entry, or it becomes a little bit convoluted and confusing, like somebody's dream where the rules of normal reality cease to exist. This is where you know a time shift is being used, typically that of a flashback into a memory of the past or into a dream sequence, each of these being used symbolically to reinforce either the boy's internal conflict or one of the greater issues in the text. Ultimately, Requiem for a Beast is a really valuable text to study at an ATAR level because the purpose that can be drawn from this text is really broad, and the syllabus concepts that we address in this course can be applied in a range of different ways. When it comes to looking at the central ideas, the issues, the representations of individuals and groups, or the attitudes, values, perspectives, and voices in this text, the following list will give you an indication of some of the main concepts that are being dealt with. Please keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list. Neither are any of these subpoints being elaborated on in terms of what exactly is being represented about prejudice or about power and authority, for instance. There is still some work to be done here in delving into these elements of the text and discussing exactly what about them is being communicated. Finally, when it comes to Requiem for a Beast, there are a lot of different ways you can approach your analysis of this text, but the following steps are a really useful starting point. Firstly, recognise that the structure of the text is in fact an element of its construction. It is a technique and it is something you can discuss in your analysis. So start by looking at the title page. Consider the symbolism and illusion of the Latin titles and the value this may have. Start by listening to the corresponding audio track. The CD-ROM can be found in the back of your book. Consider the mood that is evoked by this song and how this is meant to mirror the atmosphere created in the narrative itself. And ensure you're going to the back of the book and having a look at the lyrics to both the Mungolan and Latin songs that are being used in these tracks. Secondly, read the text in a very similar way that you would a comic book. Because the images are so integral to the meaning in Requiem for a Beast, you need to consider how the construction of these images and the use of visual techniques enhance mood and atmosphere, but also that the image themselves can be read like you would written text. Read the text using model of eye movement. That is, you naturally read from the top left to the bottom right of the page, scanning across the images and words in the way that you would when you're reading a page of text. What relationships do you draw between the objects in this frame? What sort of juxtaposition is being used here to reinforce meaning? Also, consider the use of font. When you notice the font has changed, it is a different person speaking, a different point of view being employed. You need to pay attention to this to ensure that you don't find yourselves confused by the text. Note the colour of the pages. Are they white? Are they black? Does this denote a shift into a dream or into a memory? And finally, symbolism. Pay attention to the symbolism. Pay attention to the allusions to elements of context that you have already researched, and come back to this context research. Matt Otley has imbued this text with an enormous amount of symbolism, and a lot of value can be taken from this in analysing the text. Keep in mind that you can always come back to your context notes, and quite often the questions that have been asked on that slide will give you an indication as to what the text is attempting to elicit from you. Good luck, ladies and gentlemen, and we wish you well on your journey into Requiem for a Beast. May it be a successful and enjoyable one.